sounds, I mean, I can hear you, it's almost like you're in there.
If we are, that PA, that lobby is on a different little amp thing.
But I'm on YouTube and
Yeah. It is down here. I'm looking at the green light, I'm looking at full battery, but I don't have anything here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, Halloween's mentioned that. Look at the mic on the remix. Well, I'm not sure. Let me have the control. What's there? 1, 2, 3. What's not coming into the remix? Okay, so let's. Well, that's a new problem.
I thought that new technology back then was pretty good.
it's,
It looked good.
it's supposed to be,
Uh,
it's supposed to be, but now look at this.
is it picking up what we're saying? Good. I'm gonna go sing. I'm gonna start singing. I'll tell you jokes.
It says be quiet. No.
Oh, just lost the projector
You
too.
just talk. Becky's picking it up on hers.
Huh?
Becky's picking it up on hers.
Yeah, you're picking it up because of this mic.
Oh,
That mic right there is, so this is my, you got sound, you'll have that mic. Eileen said she could hear us. Something's. I'm gonna play.
change the channels with you?
It changed the channel. Yeah. Okay, you can kill it. Okay, we should be back. It's always 45 seconds delayed. You've got to remember that. Yeah, it takes a little bit to finally get through. Okay, so we should be back online. Everything good to go? All right, well, let's start this again. I'll edit all that out and just start from here. Well, good evening. Time to start our evening Bible study. We're looking at the characters of the Bible. We've gotten up to the point now we're going to be on Moses. And I think when we take a look at like all the characters that we've gone through, which are amazing, I think that with Joseph and now Moses, we move into like a whole different level of character study, the roles that these individuals played. Not to minimize, Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob, but there's such a difference when we start to get to Moses. Moses is much greater than I think what we give him credit for. And I believe that's because we, as Christians, live in the New Testament. And so we kind of are always looking at, well, that's old, and we're in the new. And as I was preparing the classes, going back through and looking at some of the things about Moses, one of the greatest things that came across is, there's power and there's greatness. And we can see a lot of leaders who have power. They have a lot of power, but they don't have greatness. There's very few that we see historically throughout history, not just the United States, that have power, but doesn't mean they're great. Doesn't make them good. Moses was both. Moses had power and authority, and he was great in his role. And one of the things that's, as Christians, you hear that all the time. We say that, well, Moses is great. The Jews hold him up. He's a fantastic character. But, it's not just Christians, but many historical figures throughout history have studied Moses, have looked at Moses. And one of the greatest things that I found that was very fascinating is in the U.S. House of Representatives, above the very top of the speaker's chair there, and I'm going to zoom in. If you'll look, there are these white marble reliefs, and they're little circles. Online you might be able to see them, but they're above the doors. There's 23 of these. And those reliefs they're all profile pictures, in other words. And this is an example of one that you see. And what's fascinating is of the 23, they're characters throughout history. Hammurabi, they even have Napoleon. They have people who were looking and were considered people who were looking towards establishing a society on law and order and decency. Doesn't mean they stayed that way, like with Napoleon necessarily. But there were 23 of these. And in 1950, when the House of Representatives was being remodeled, they put those reliefs, white marble reliefs, 23 of them. But every one of them, one side of the House of Representatives is looking to the right, and the other side is looking to the left. It's a profile picture. You know what they're all looking at? In the center above the House chamber's chair, where the chair is, it's Moses. They're all looking at Moses. And if you go to the Supreme Court, you know what you find there? You find a statue of Moses. I mean, you find there's so many things that we see that our country, regardless if you want to make it religious or not, but historically, Moses is a great character of what he did. And this is just something I thought I'd share with you because I just learned this, and I didn't know that. Of course, I've never toured it, and it wasn't something brought out. But the idea that even our government and many governments, all those 23 leaders, that they mention Moses. Except Hammurabi, he was before, but there were people who were great leaders that were trying to establish moral, decent government and power. But the way our government, whoever the artist was, every day when those House of Representatives go in there, they have all these guys up there, whether they know it or realize it or not, they probably don't. They're all looking towards the center point. And Moses is the only one that's looking forward. He's looking forward. So we talk about Moses and his greatness and just some overall things. He's mentioned 750 times in the Old Testament, more than any other character, in different ways, but his name constantly is brought up. 80 times in the New Testament. And what is interesting is when we look at the Old Covenant, when we say that Old Covenant, Old Testament, the more familiar way we refer to it is what? The Law of Moses. Now, so we're under a New Testament, a New Covenant. Paul wrote most of it, but you notice it's not Paul's gospel, Paul's law. Now, I know it sounds kind of trivial, but, God allowed and has it, and it's named the law of Moses. It's really God's law, isn't it? So I think, it shows that idea of the relationship and the important role that Moses played in God's plan of fulfilling his promises to Abraham and to us as well. He also, there's another verse that is just overwhelming sometimes when you just think about God expressing it by saying, we talk to each other as friends. Now, David, we remember this, he's a man after my own heart. And that's touching. But we forget that God also said that I talk with Moses like we're friends. Now, think about a friend versus an acquaintance, or somebody who is not as intelligent or equal to you, that you don't think about. A lot of times you still, regardless, you will put them a little bit in their position. You have a different relationship. You don't share things and talk to them about a lot of common things like you do a friend. But God said we spoke like we would, like two friends are talking. Another amazing thing that you see, that we will come across these as well, but is the idea that whenever God was ready to punish Israel because of their sins, and he was so angry with them, you remember he was going to destroy them. Moses, we know he interceded, but one of the things that God proposed to Moses was, I will destroy them and I will make a nation from you. Now, God knew his character. God knew that Moses was a man. I mean, if there was one person that could influence future generations and have that ability to start new, versus these slaves that he brought out that are so ingrained in Egyptian culture and all the stuff that they're through, and the bickering and the fighting and the lack of faithfulness. And then here's Moses, and he offered Moses the opportunity to become the main man of all the genealogy. And it would still be in keeping with what God had promised Abraham. It would not be in conflict, right? Because Moses is a descendant of Abraham. And Moses said no. Now, we don't know if God was just testing him or doing it to demonstrate to us today an aspect of his character. But for a person of such power and such critical role that he played, it shows the only other person that at least I know of historically is George Washington didn't really want to be president. There was many things about him. There was actually, right after the Revolutionary War was over, where his own officers were ready to do a coup because they were fed up with the Congress. They were like, these guys, there was a very turbulent period right after the Revolution War was over. We won, and Congress was in chaos. And these generals were like, let's overthrow this and set this up, and they wanted Washington. Well, when Washington learned about this, he went and met with all of them. And there's a letter you can find online of his speech, what he told them. And it was basically, they said by the time he got done, they were in tears. They were so shamed, and that's the type of man where you don't see that. I think Dwight Eisenhower was another one that I think of that as well, that somebody who didn't take the advantage of the powerful position that they were in and capitalize on it, like we have seen so many before that happened. So in this time, we see the transition from where Joseph, if we go back and kind of link in our previous character and our history, because it's important to see that. We remember that Abraham was promised that through his seed would come this nation, but that these people, his descendants, would go off into captivity, and they would be there for 400 years, and then he would deliver them out. He didn't give much more details than that. Then we see Israel/Jacob having his sons, and then Joseph going off into Egypt which then set the pathway to taking care of them, bringing them into Egypt. And 70 of them, and as we start even into Exodus chapter 1, we see he lists the sons, and that 70 of them go into Egypt. It's an interesting transition going into looking at Exodus period. But once they get in there, they get the choice land. Now Goshen, I'll have a map we'll look at. Goshen was a very critical place, because one, it was a place they could have livestock. And the fact that they were isolated, remember that. You know, I really kept bringing this point up, that one of the things about the Egyptians and those from Canaan were they were sheep herders, and they did not like them because of the Hyksos pharaohs who had come through that same area and had basically migrated and eventually overthrew the pharaoh and took over and established a whole nother dynasty of pharaohs, but they weren't really Egyptians. And so whenever the true Egyptians finally kicked them out, you can see this racism, this bitterness towards anything to do with their culture. So when Joseph brings, and Jacob and they all come in, well, they're sheep herders. And so that's one of the things we see in the conversation between, Joseph and the Pharaoh at that time was, they're sheep herders. And so they're allowed to set up in Goshen. They get some of the choice land, but it still keeps them separate. Well, they do real well. They continue to populate and grow and grow and grow, which then is going to create a situation to where, we're looking at 400 years. So if we say, you start from the time that Jacob comes in, just take from that point, you're looking at about 130 years of the influence, 120 years or so of influence that Joseph had in his leadership role serving Pharaoh. But we got another 300 years where he's not around. Now, to put that into perspective, I want you to think about our history and our history as a country. I mean, how far back do we even go? We don't go 300 years. And very few, especially today, even know who James Madison was. Who's James Madison? Who's that guy? He's one of the founding fathers. How many people could even name the founding fathers? And we're not even 300 years away. Not very many. I mean, historically, if you go back even 400 or 500 years, who would you remember about any of those people if a history book wasn't telling you about it? So it seems natural that eventually time would happen and it would change. The situation would change. But I want to look at a little bit of also looking at the personality as described by the Hebrew writer in chapter 11. In chapter 11, he describes it, and he's talking about those with faith. But it reveals some things that when we come back and we start looking at the actual verses, I think help to add to it. Because they're not in contradiction, but it helps to explain some behaviors that we'll look at. So I think it's important. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful. And they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking toward the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. So when we back up and look at this, we find a historical account, a very quick one, but key things, and we're going to look at tonight especially, is one, looking at his parents, looking at that faith there. And we can now kind of look at the anatomy of the faith of the Israelites as they were in Egypt when Moses brings them out. One, they weren't following really after God. Their religion was really just more of a custom. It was something that was just handed down to them. It was traditions and stuff, but not something the majority of them really cared or loved. They brought a lot of their gods out with them. We know that. But there were still some that were very faithful. And The idea, we see the providential, and we'll talk about that, the way that the child was protected, Moses. But there reached a point. Now, there's 3 phases to his life that we look at. He lived to 120. 40 years from the time of birth to as being a prince, then there's the second 40 years that he's out in exile as a shepherd. And then the next 40 years, the last 40 years, is being a deliverer. So it's, as we see this, he reaches that point, and that's what the Hebrew writer is bringing out. Look at the faith that is going on here. Faith comes by hearing God's word. So his parents heard and knew and believed, and that's what gave them that courage. And as Moses, how did he get this faith? Think about 40 years of being raised in an Egyptian house. 40-year-old man. He was completely Egyptian. I mean, his mother was with him for a short period of time, nursemaiding him, and the rest of it was completely Egyptian. Walking around the palace, chasing around, seeing all the dignitaries and watching the Pharaoh. I mean, he was a prince. And so this faith was planted by his mom. That's something that we see this link here that the Hebrew writer is talking about. But there's something that triggered in him that he's talking about, this idea that he was willing to sacrifice. Now, I love the Hebrew writer in verse 26 there when he says he would rather take the reproach of Christ. Was Christ around back then? Have you ever thought of that? That isn't an accident. The Hebrew writer didn't slip. But it's an idea linked with God, right? But also the understanding that there's something greater coming. An understanding of this Messiah type that would be coming. So, coming back to the Exodus 1, in chapter 1, the population grew so rapidly that the king, the Pharaoh, became very nervous, and rightfully so. Remember, the Hyksos pharaohs who had overthrown, this has happened to them before, but it's been over 500 years. So again, it can't be that much of a recent history. They've been in 400 years. Look back when the Hyksos pharaohs, you're looking 500-600 years that this did happen to them before. But when we look at this idea of how rapid they become this threat to his government and not understanding the history, this is where I think leaders need to study history.
It repeats itself.
Mm-hmm. It repeats itself, and as well, if he would have looked back, he would have seen the relationship that Joseph had with the Pharaoh at that time, and that they're not a threat, that they've been a blessing. But they didn't. So this is a failure of him looking at this idea of strictly, momentarily, right here and now, and feeling like, well, we got to get rid of them. We got to curtail them. And so he goes through this process. And so we start reading in 8. We're going to pick up there. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So he's looking at this idea from the point that they're a threat because they're foreigners. They've never really been integrated. You notice that? I mean, we're considered a melting pot, and we have people from multi-nations. It was never even thought of until this recent silliness that's going on in our country. But I know especially now, it took many years, but even the Irish, I mean, when they first came over, they were treated harshly. The Italians, even. Now, we are so far from New York, but if you even go back to New York to this day, there are areas, and even in LA, Chinatown, there's a place where the Italians and stuff, but over the years, they have integrated pretty good. I mean, we are all kind of that melting pot. This never seems to have happened with the Semites, because really they're Hebrew or the Semites. They never were really accepted, and I think it has to do with that idea of the Hyksos pharaohs in that time period. They just were never, this prejudice stayed there. But as they continue to grow, now notice he describes them, they're too large in population, and he sees them too mighty. So he's looking probably at the populations, the census, and going, they could right now possibly overthrow us. So we got to do something about it.
They never overstepped their boundaries.
Yeah, they never had at that point. That's the thing. You're right, Becky. There's nothing here that he says, oh yeah, we increase incidents of them protesting and trying to overthrow us. No, it's just observations. They're getting large. The population's growing, and they're going to and they're foreigners, and they're probably more likely to join with those foreigners than us. Why would he think that? This is their home. That Egypt is their home. That's where they're from. It's like, so he's going to institute a plan. And so he starts it out. It's kind of a phased plan. So he says, therefore, let's set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. When we look at this area here on the map, you can see, let me kind of shift it around. And I just kind of learned how to do all this zooming. I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. You can see the location where these little arrows, that's Ramses and then Pithom. And as we look at this, what's interesting is the avenue of approach. Those two cities that he had them build were on what they call military avenue approach, that if enemy were to come, that they'd come in and invade. And there, if you look as well, you can see they're in Goshen, and that's right on the edge there. So the first people that an invading army would come to would be to the Israelites. And so, there's that idea. But building these cities was also a fortification. Stores, these cities of stores were basically critical cities that had supplies and resources more than anything. So they were fortified. And so he is looking completely at security of his nation. But as we read, the more and more that they inflicted upon them, it didn't stop. It didn't stop them from continuing to grow in population, and just seemed to be getting more and more powerful. And I don't think that's by accident. No, this is God's providence happening. God knows his plan. God knows what he's fixing to do. And I think this is using the heart of this Pharaoh and the ignorance of him in a sense of getting everything in order for him to deliver them out. So they ruthlessly, we see in verse 13, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all the work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So they're using them to build these buildings, and what was fascinating is archaeologists have found buildings with an inscription on the side of them that says, this building was built with no free people. Yeah. In other words, we only build. What it made me think of, this is maybe terrible, is I will say this was built by the union. It was a union job, something like that. Except this is the opposite in saying there were no free people that we forced to build these buildings. So, yeah, some of the buildings that archaeologists have found had these markings on the building saying no free people were used in building this building. So this brutality that continually is being inflicted and they called it, I heard it something called like the oven of, it was just the jobs that they were doing and what they were doing and being experienced to, the brutality and the amount of labor was so, it was beyond just normal slave treatment. And, you know, some people could say, well, why would God? And it's a good question. Why would God allow this?
Because they will overcome. And that's what I was going to say. This is sometimes people's mentality, whether your boss or coworkers, they think the more they try to oppress you and suppress your thoughts, God will intervene, and you will come out ahead as long as you're faithful.
It's got a couple of layers to that lesson, doesn't it? One, those who are trying to repress God's people, you're going to lose. You're not, you know, you're going to lose. No matter how, think of the Roman Empire. You know, no matter how much the Romans tried to destroy the church, it grew to the point where it actually played a key role in overthrowing the empire. The other part, if you are a Christian in the first century or you were an Israelite in Egypt and you're going through this suffering, it's kind of interesting that in a lot of ways there's a parallel between the first century Christians with the gospel and those that were in Egypt. They're both going to be delivered, but the world is going to attack righteousness. And God uses that as an opportunity to show them, prove to them, you can't. You're going to lose.
You're not more powerful than God.
You're not more powerful. And he's going to use the foolishness again. The foolishness of the cross to the Jew, right, and the wisdom to the Jew and to the Gentile, but also to the Egyptians. I mean, when you look at the way that they're going to go down, the way this is going to happen, I mean, you're talking about, again, a methodology that is not natural for a way a revolt would go and the way that people would be set forward. And the idea, if you're one of these slaves, that where's your faith? You're reaching, some of those people knew the promise. And the promise was, we would be in bondage, we would be here in Egypt for 400 years. The calendar's clicking. They were given dates. So there were people that knew this. But how many didn't? It's very similar to God's word. You know, there's a lot of Christians that, you know, they're suffering, but they don't know enough about God's word to stay faithful because they forget about it. Just like a lot of the Hebrews here forget about the promise to Abraham and the promise to Jacob that he's going to deliver them. He's going to deliver them. And when this oppression is starting to crush them, they're right there at the 400-year point. But a lot of them aren't seeing this. But I think there are those like Moses' family that is going to. So he moves to phase 2. Then the king said to the Hebrew midwives, one of them was named Shiphrah and the other one Purah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them in the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it's a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. Of all the people to ask to commit infanticide, you know, a midwife? They love babies. I can't imagine, you know, a baby being born and just because he's male. The birth stool basically is a position of birthing that the mother wouldn't be able to see them. So they could get away with killing the baby and then saying, oh, I'm so sorry. But of course the midwives, who are they? They're Hebrews. You know, they're not going to, they feared God. You know, a lot of times, you know, we have to remember this lesson as well. When the government pushes us to doing things that we know are immoral, I don't care how good a citizen you are. If it's immoral and it's against God, we should not fear the repercussions. If it's wrong, with God, it's wrong. And that's the one place where we should stand up and say, I'm not participating in this. I'm not gonna do it. And so so next phase doesn't work. So he has a conversation with him, right? So the king of Egypt called the midwives in and said, why have you done this? You let the male children live. The midwife said to the Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwife comes to them. So you can't kill them secretly. You didn't ask us to kill them secretly. I mean, you asked us to kill them secretly. Now if I show up and I take the baby, is not needed. Don't need you. Baby's here. So there's no job for him. So they're not like Egyptian women. They're delivering them. So they work their way away from this. So infanticide, reducing the male population, is not working. So God dealt with the midwives. He was good with them, you know. He dealt well with them. And I think, you know, it said that the people grew, multiplied very strong because the midwives feared God. He gave them families as well. So that, you know, even those that may have been barren and unable to have children, had children. So now he goes to phase 3. Am I in right phases? Where finally he just commands his people, everyone. The Pharaoh commanded his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. This is going to create, if this was to continue, and I don't know how long, you know, we don't, if you think about, we were to just consider this edict that's been given from the time Moses is born, and we're looking at another 80 years before he comes back. How long did they continue this? We don't know. They keep killing. I mean, there reaches a point where you start killing your own labor force. When you start killing the babies, at some point you got to stop. He's not going to continue this indefinite. It can't continue. But what a way to kill them too. Throwing a child into the water and having them drown, and then eventually eaten by the crocodiles. But let them. So now we come to the birth of Moses, and we have the introduction of his mother and his father in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. And now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. Now, she's already had 2 children, though. Who are they? Mm-hmm. And Aaron. You know, we kind of lose them because we go over it real quick. The fact that we get it later on because when he exits with them and his family and everything, we learn about that. But so Aaron is lucky. You know, he was already old enough to escape this because it wasn't during the birth when he was born. So she hides him 3 months. Now think about it. All the babies that were born at that time are gone. Homes are silent. And then you got this one house that a baby can be crying. And baby Moses was like any baby. He's going to cry when he's hungry. He's going to cry in the middle of the night. He's going to cry. You know, he's going to tussle and stuff like that. And it reaches a point, in other words, where she could no longer conceal, and that at any moment, can you imagine the stress she was going through? The stress of trying to keep him quiet, and fear that any time somebody could bust through and come and rip him out of her arms. So 3 months old, and I can't imagine this either. I mean, I remember when Eli was born here in the hospital and they had to take him to El Paso, and he had anyway, won't go into the medical thing, but they had to transport him. And I will never forget that scene when they came in to take him and transport him away from Crystal. Oh my goodness, that was heart-wrenching to watch. And I can't imagine, now, with my other grandchildren, imagine them saying, I've had him for 3 months and you bond with him, and now she has to give him up. But she, as a mom, she's not doing this risking his death. And I think this is where, when we come to the plan, what they do in verse 3, and when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket and made brushes and dabbed it with bitten and pitch, and put him in it and placed it among the reeds of the bank. Now that's where she's hiding him, okay? I don't know about you, but a lot of times I would see this little basket, told and put in the river, and he floated off. No, that's as much an infanticide, killing him. What she did was she was using that as a location to protect him and to take care of him. Now, I see God's providence working through this because Miriam is watching out. She's not close enough, but she's away to where, because if she went up and sat there by the basket, it'd draw attention.
They must have known that Pharaoh's daughter did walk.
That's what I believe. They knew that she was there, and I think that's why the providence of God in placing Moses right there in a location. But it wasn't to just abandon. She wasn't putting him into this basket.
By faith, she just let him just.
Yeah, drift down. And so, you've kind of got that sometimes from people, right? Have you heard that? It's almost like, it's like you get this idea that somehow he is put in this basket and they just let him drift off. I don't know. I'm not going to blame my Bible teachers when I was growing up. Maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just bad movies, whatever. And the more I think about it, the more you look at this is a mom who is doing everything she can.
Well, she risked her life, and her child's life. So she's not just going to let him just drift down and go, I hope someone finds him.
So this is a continuing care for him, putting him into a location where Miriam can go. They can still take care of him. I imagine they're not going to, we don't know how long. There's nothing to indicate, was this hours? Was this days? I don't know how long a child could, a 3-month-old, be in a basket. And I don't even know how big the basket was. We assume that too. I've seen, all kinds of pictures, where he's this little baby bobbing in a little basket with some pitch on it and stuff. I bet as a mom, this was the best basket you could make.
She had baby bottles or diapers or anything to put.
Yeah, she doesn't have anything to put. So that's why I think Miriam is like guarding and watching, which is going to play a role, right? So in verse 4, and as the sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. In other words, she's watching guard. She's not staging to go back and tell Mom, he floated down the river and just went off and down the stream. I don't know. No, it was to watch and see if something happens, what happens to him. Now think about that as a young girl. Your little brother, again, I think of like my granddaughter and her little brother. And I know they're a little older, but Miriam is. But still, the deal of what this family is having to go through. So now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. They're on guard, in other words. They're checking it out because they're crocodiles. Don't forget. So they're watching and checking out and making sure she's okay. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" So she identified immediately This is a Hebrew child. Now, what would she know about it? What would she know that her father has ordered? You think she doesn't know? How do you sneak this little guy into the house? I mean, there's something about this, and there's something just about the way that it's coming into Pharaoh's house, isn't it? I mean, first off, he's crying, which is probably right. I mean, a baby left like that.
I don't think that it's like a small house where you can hear everybody, and the father and the daughter like, hey, what's up today? Oh, well, I found this baby, and I feel sorry for the baby. No, I don't think it was anything like that. I think with Pharaoh having so many things to do and oversee and make sure people were following his edicts, he didn't say anything to the daughter.
She very well could have. This would be a pretty big cover-up, because when he turns 12, what are you going to explain to your daddy about? Where'd that boy come from, right? I mean, at some point, Pharaoh's going to come home, and there's a kid. Now, now she's already married, and she has children, and just kind of like in a progression, and it's possible, a big house like that. I mean, but there's also this side. Little girl. Mm-hmm. How many little girls have their daddies wrapped around their finger? And what's the harm? I mean, he's not going to be a threat. He's a baby. We'll raise him as Egyptian, and he doesn't know who his mom is. So we'll just raise him. And but here comes the very source of the downfall of Egypt into Pharaoh's house by his daughter. And it's going to be her brother, one of her brothers, that's going to end up being, depending on which Pharaoh you believe was, that is going to be the one that's going to bring down the Pharaoh, the Egyptian, the Egypt as a nation too. So, of course, we know that the Pharaoh's daughter tells her, yeah, go. So she went, she called the mother's child. She went and got mom. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. Now, we don't know how long that is. I mean, there's variations on, like with Hannah, when Hannah had Samuel. How long would you go before, like when Hannah had her child and she promised to dedicate him, and then she takes him to the temple and says, we don't know. I mean, when you say nursing, it could be, I mean, a year, it could be 2 years, and what exactly is the totality of when you say nursing? In our society, it's breastfeeding. And when a child can finally, eat solid foods and doesn't need, nursing. Another thing that's kind of sad is when you think about all the women Hebrew moms, who had their babies taken away from them, that she is very blessed to be able to go back and be united with her child. That's something that is also a great blessing. Now, this is where we see kind of that idea of not exactly understanding in 10, and when the child grew older, well, what does that mean? How old? I get the idea that 4 to 5, 5 to 6, some say 7 to 8 years of age, and then he goes. Now, tell me you're going to separate a child from his mommy. And also the idea is that you can't tell him that I'm your mom. Because if it comes back, that could be something. So, but we can see the faith that was planted in him. That's what we saw with the Hebrews, what he was talking about. There's a level here that we know that he received something that was implanted in him. Some of it providentially, maybe that God had done. But look at his name. This is something that we'll talk and then we'll wrap up. The idea of his name, Moses. This name is, source of it is an Egyptian name. And it can mean son. There's a couple of Egyptian names, Ambrose, but it has basically, if you look them up, I just forgot them. But it has Moses at the end of their names. I think it's Thumosis and then Ambrosis, something. But it's got almost the same as Moses, basically. But in the Hebrew, it is to draw up. And so we have kind of put the rest of that all together. But it is interesting that from an Egyptian name that he receives, which has the Hebrew meaning of draw up out, drew him out of the water. And that's what she says. So she's the one that ends up naming him. So we're going to go and stop there, and we'll continue next week. I hope that you'll be able to join us 6 p.m. next Wednesday, this Sunday morning, 9:45 for Bible study, and then at 10:45 for worship. Before we wrap up, let's go ahead and have a quick prayer. Our Blessed Father, again, for this time that we've shared with one another in studying your word, we pray that we'd be able to learn some from this story of Moses and the children of Israel and what they and how they persevered. You are continuing with and delivering them through their suffering. Are doing the same for us, Father, and we are so blessed with that knowledge. And we pray that we'll continue to glorify you in all that we do and say. And we ask this in Jesus Christ's most precious name. Amen. All right. God bless.